Imagine living a life that feels perfectly ordinary, where each day passes in a routine of comfort and familiarity. You wake up beside the person you love, the one you've shared your dreams with, and you think, this is it. This is everything I've ever wanted. But what if, one quiet evening, the very person you trust most asks you to do something so strange, so unsettling, that it makes you question everything? For Sarah, that was the night her marriage. Her entire reality was changed forever. What began as a seemingly innocent request from her husband, Mark, would soon lead to a shocking discovery, one that left her questioning not only his actions but everything she thought she knew about him. A single moment, one conversation in the privacy of their home, unraveled a truth so disturbing that it seemed impossible. Sarah and Mark had always appeared to be the perfect couple. He was successful, kind, and affectionate, qualities that made him well liked by everyone who knew him. Sarah, a dedicated nurse, was the calm and compassionate partner, the kind of wife who would go to any length to ensure her husband was happy. They shared a life filled with love, trust, and most importantly, respect. But over time, Sarah began to notice little things that felt off. Mark, who had always been open with her, became more distant, his late-night work hours increasing, his mood shifting in ways she couldn't explain. She tried to dismiss her concerns, telling herself that it was just stress or work pressures. But that night, everything changed when Mark asked her to do something in their bedroom, a request that at first seemed harmless but quickly escalated into something she could never have imagined. At first, Sarah didn't think much of it. It was late, they had just finished dinner, and the day's events had left them both tired. But as Mark leaned in and whispered his request, something in her gut told her to pay closer attention. He wanted to try something new, something that felt a bit out of character. It wasn't the request itself that made her uneasy, it was the way he asked. The calmness in his voice, the lack of emotion in his eyes, made her question if she really knew him at all. In that moment, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She felt a deep, inexplicable unease, but she couldn't pinpoint why. She agreed to go along with it, wanting to please him, hoping that it would bring them closer, restore the connection that seemed to have been fading. But what she didn't know was that the request would mark the beginning of a night filled with tension, betrayal, and a discovery that no one, least of all Sarah, was prepared for. As we reflect on this real-life story, subscribe. And don't forget to turn on the notification bell for more daily stories that need to be heard. Hit that subscribe button. And let us hear from you in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. Now let's continue. As Sarah tried to carry out Mark's request, she noticed that the atmosphere between them had shifted. The familiar warmth that once existed between them seemed to dissipate, replaced by something unfamiliar and unsettling. It was as if Mark was no longer the man she had married, but someone else entirely, someone who was hiding something. The hours that followed blurred together as Sarah tried to make sense of what was happening. What started as a simple request soon turned into something much darker. In a cruel twist of fate, Sarah's trust in her husband was shattered, and she found herself facing a reality that was as confusing as it was terrifying. Something had been hidden from her, something that Mark had been concealing for far longer than she realized. As the night wore on, Sarah's initial discomfort grew into a deep sense of dread. Her husband's behavior, his odd requests, and the strange atmosphere in their home left her with a feeling that she couldn't escape. She wanted to believe that it was just a misunderstanding, that maybe she was reading too much into things. But deep down, she knew that what was happening wasn't normal. The next morning, things only became clearer. Mark's demeanor had shifted once again, but this time, there was something colder about it. It wasn't the warm, loving husband. Sarah knew it was a man hiding something, a man whose actions spoke louder than words ever could. Sarah began to question every moment they had shared, wondering if she had missed something important along the way. Had she been blind to the signs? Was there more to Mark than she ever realized? The investigation that followed would reveal details that Sarah never could have anticipated. As police began to uncover the truth behind Mark's actions, they pieced together a picture of a man who had been living a double life. The clues, once subtle, now came into focus, and it became clear that what Sarah had thought was a simple request was anything but. It wasn't just a request in the bedroom that shattered their marriage, it was the discovery of hidden secrets, manipulations, and a life that Sarah hadn't known existed. With every new piece of evidence, the truth became more chilling. The question wasn't just what had happened that night, but how Sarah had been deceived for so long. As the case unfolded, it became clear that Mark's behavior wasn't a result of a passing phase or a temporary lapse in judgment. It was the culmination of years of hidden motives, manipulative actions, and a darkness that Sarah had never seen coming. The investigation revealed layers of lies, each more disturbing than the last, until the full scope of Mark's actions was finally understood. But it wasn't just about the crime that had taken place, it was about the toll it took on Sarah. The emotional and psychological scars that would stay with her long after the case was closed. The betrayal she felt was not just the result of one man's actions, but of years of trust broken and a love that had been twisted into something unrecognizable. As the investigation progressed, Sarah was left to pick up the pieces of her life, haunted by the thought that she had been so close to a person who had hidden such a terrible truth from her. The reality of what had happened that night would take her down a path she could never have imagined, one that forced her to confront the darkest corners of her marriage and her own heart. I do hope you have subscribed already, as it is about to get really interesting. Sarah and Mark appeared to be a couple who had it all. Living in a quiet suburban neighborhood, they embodied the life so many aspired to. Sarah, a dedicated nurse, was known for her compassion and ability to handle even the most stressful situations with grace. Mark, her husband, had a thriving career in tech and was often described by friends and colleagues as charming and dependable. Together, they seemed to represent the ideal partnership: steady, supportive, and deeply in love. But, as is often the case, appearances can be deceiving. While their friends admired their relationship, the reality behind closed doors began to feel different for Sarah. She started to notice subtle but undeniable shifts in Mark's behavior. He had become more withdrawn, less communicative, and at times uncharacteristically irritable. These changes were gradual, almost imperceptible at first, but over time they became harder for Sarah to ignore. It wasn't just his mood that had shifted. Mark, who once shared everything with Sarah, began to guard certain aspects of his life. He spent more time alone, buried in his phone or computer, and was increasingly vague about where he had been or what he was doing. Late-night work meetings became more frequent, and his explanations for his absences began to feel rehearsed, almost mechanical. Sarah, ever the optimist, chose to believe that these changes were temporary. She attributed his behavior to stress from work, brushing off her growing concerns as overthinking. After all, every couple has their ups and downs, right? But deep inside, an unshakable feeling of unease began to take root. One evening, after a particularly long week, Sarah returned home hoping for a quiet night with her husband. As they sat together, Mark turned to her with an expression she hadn't seen before, one that was almost unrecognizable. He had a request, a proposition he wanted to discuss. His voice was calm, measured, but there was something about the way he spoke that sent a chill through Sarah. The request itself seemed unusual, but not entirely alarming at first. Mark wanted to try something different, something he claimed would bring them closer as a couple. Sarah hesitated, unsure of how to respond. She wanted to trust him, to believe that his intentions were rooted in love and connection. After all, this was her husband, the man she had built a life with, the person she thought she knew better than anyone. As she nodded her agreement, she couldn't have known that this simple moment, this seemingly innocuous conversation, would be the start of something that would unravel their entire world. It wasn't just the request itself that left her unsettled, it was the growing sense that there was more to Mark's actions than he was letting on. Something had shifted between them, and Sarah was about to uncover just how deeply those changes ran. It was a quiet evening when Mark made his request, a simple one at first glance, but it was enough to make Sarah pause. He asked if they could try something new in their intimacy, something to shake up their routine, he said. Sarah, eager to bring back the connection they had once shared, agreed. She didn't think much of it at the time, after all. Couples experiment in various ways, don't they? It was, or so she thought, a harmless request, born out of a desire to reignite some spark between them. But as Mark's suggestion grew more specific, Sarah's unease deepened. His behavior, always calm and collected, had taken a turn. There was something in his voice, something off in the way he looked at her. It wasn't the same affection she had once felt from him. It was as though there was a coldness behind his eyes. And then there were the little details that began to nag at her mind. His insistence, his growing impatience when she seemed unsure, his subtle but undeniable urgency. Mark, who had always been understanding of Sarah's comfort, now seemed almost demanding. What was intended to be an intimate moment, a chance to reconnect, quickly spiraled into something that made Sarah question her own sense of reality. The more she went along with his request, the more she began to feel like she was no longer in control of the situation. What started as a casual idea suddenly felt like a test, like something had been set in motion, and she was powerless to stop it. As the evening unfolded, Sarah's discomfort intensified. She tried to push through, telling herself that she was just being paranoid, that everything was fine. But deep down, she knew that something wasn't right. The atmosphere between them had changed, and it wasn't just the unfamiliar request that unsettled her. There was a growing tension that she couldn't shake, a feeling that something far darker was at play. Her once loving husband now felt distant, almost as though he were a stranger. Sarah's mind raced, trying to make sense of the chaos unfolding before her. Then came the breaking point. Mark's behavior shifted dramatically. What had started as a simple request soon turned into something that terrified Sarah. His actions became aggressive, his words sharper. The tenderness she once knew was replaced by force, and in that moment, Sarah realized that the man she had trusted for so long was no longer the same. The physical and emotional violence that followed left her inshockable to process what had just occurred. The trust she had in him, built over years of marriage, was shattered in an instant. The terror she felt that night did not fade with the dawn. In the following days, Sarah began to piece together the events that had led up to that night. What she found was even more chilling than she could have imagined. Police, when they were eventually involved, uncovered disturbing evidence that suggested Mark's actions weren't just a spur-of-the-moment decision, but the culmination of a series of disturbing behaviors. Investigators discovered hidden documents, cryptic messages, and other unsettling materials scattered throughout their home, things that Sarah had never seen, things Mark had carefully concealed from her. It became clear that the request in the bedroom was just the surface of something far more sinister. Mark had been living a double life, one filled with secrets and lies. The evidence painted a picture of a man who had been planning, manipulating, and hiding his true intentions for far longer than Sarah had ever suspected. The request that seemed harmless at first was merely a gateway to a much darker truth-zone that would ultimately lead to the unraveling of everything Sarah thought she knew about her husband. Detectives were initially baffled. On the surface, it seemed like the case of a couple in distress, perhaps a disagreement that had spiraled out of control. But as they began to investigate, the true nature of the crime became increasingly clear. Sarah's account of the night was harrowing, but it was just the beginning. What had initially seemed like a case of a wife's discomfort with her husband's behavior was revealing itself to be much darker than anyone could have anticipated. The request in the bedroom, which had initially seemed like an isolated incident, was actually the trigger for a much deeper problem. The investigation began to show that Mark's behavior had been manipulative, and at times, even violent. But what motivated him to do this? And why did the violence emerge only after years of seemingly normal behavior? Detective Jane Doe, a seasoned investigator with the local police force, was assigned to the case. With a reputation for uncovering hidden truths in even the most complicated cases, Detective Doe approached the investigation with methodical precision. As she and her team began to examine the evidence, it became clear that this wasn't just about a broken marriage. Something much more sinister was unfolding. Please, my lovely family, remember to subscribe and hit the bell icon so that you won't ever miss the next thrilling story coming up next. Sarah's statement, while emotional, was full of inconsistencies that raised red flags, but Detective Doe knew better than to take anything at face value. She interviewed Sarah's friends, colleagues, and family members, trying to get a clearer picture of Mark's behavior before the incident. Everyone had the same impression. Mark was charming, caring, and appeared to be the perfect husband. But as the investigation dug deeper, cracks began to show in his seemingly flawless exterior. The truth started to emerge in bits and pieces, each discovery more chilling than the last. The first clue came from Mark's phone records. There were strange, frequent communications with someone Sarah had never heard of, a third party, who had been in regular contact with him for weeks leading up to the incident. At first, the messages seemed innocent enough, but as the team began to analyze them, a pattern began to emerge. They weren't just casual conversations. They were full of coded language and veiled references that hinted at something darker. A conversation from just days before Sarah's disturbing experience was particularly troubling. Mark had sent a message to this mysterious individual saying, "It's all set. Tonight will be the final piece." The context of this message was unclear, but its implications were chilling. Detective Doe's team also found records of Mark's online activity. There were numerous visits to sites and forums discussing manipulation, coercion, and power dynamics topics that seemed at odds with the man everyone thought they knew. The more they uncovered, the more they realized that Mark had been preparing for this moment for a long time. His behavior wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. It was calculated, methodical, and deliberate. But the most unsettling discovery came from a series of journal entries and notes found in a locked drawer in Mark's home office. They revealed that for months, he had been planning the night Sarah would be forced to face his darker side. He had written about his desire to test Sarah's loyalty, to push her boundaries, and ultimately to see how far he could manipulate her. The entries were chilling in their clinical detachment, with detailed notes on how he planned to make Sarah feel isolated and vulnerable, how he would use their intimacy as a tool to control and dominate her. As the investigation progressed, it became clear that Mark's request in the bedroom was not just an isolated incident, it was the culmination of months of emotional and psychological manipulation. Detective Doe's team began to connect the dots. Mark's actions were part of a much larger plan to break Sarah down, to manipulate her into doing things she would never have agreed to under normal circumstances. What was perhaps most chilling about the investigation was Mark's behavior during the entire process. Throughout the questioning, he remained calm, almost eerily so. When asked about the night in question, he showed no remorse or guilt. In fact, his demeanor suggested that he believed he had done nothing wrong. He spoke about his actions in a matter-of-fact way, as if the incident had been nothing more than an unfortunate misstep in an otherwise normal marriage. His lack of empathy and his calm indifference to the damage he had caused were some of the most disturbing aspects of the case. Mark's detachment seemed to confirm what investigators had suspected all along. He was a man who had been living a double life, hiding a side of himself that was capable of great manipulation and cruelty. As the police continued their investigation, they started to uncover more about his secret life, each revelation more shocking than the last. The pieces were slowly falling into place, and with each discovery, the truth about Mark and his twisted plans became more apparent. What had started as a disturbing request in the bedroom had revealed a man capable of far greater horrors than anyone could have imagined. Detective Doe and her team were now on the verge of uncovering the full extent of Mark's manipulation and the devastating toll it had taken on Sarah's life. Just when the case seemed to be heading toward resolution, shocking revelations emerged that turned everything on its head. The investigators had been so focused on Mark's disturbing behavior in the months leading up to the crime that they hadn't fully explored his past. What they uncovered was far more unsettling than anyone could have imagined. It wasn't just that Mark had been hiding his true nature. He had been doing so for years, weaving a web of deceit and manipulation that spanned multiple relationships, not just his marriage to Sarah. Through interviews with former colleagues, ex-girlfriends, and even friends who had known Mark for years, a pattern began to emerge. Mark had a long history of using his charm and intellect to manipulate others into doing what he wanted. He had a way of making people feel safe, trustedly to exploit their vulnerabilities when the moment was right. There were whispers of financial scams, emotional abuse in past relationships, and even an unsettling history of using similar tactics in professional settings. What had appeared to be a high-functioning, successful man was slowly being revealed as a master of manipulation, a predator who had perfected his craft over time. But perhaps the most shocking twist came when investigators uncovered something completely unexpected: Sarah's own journal. While Sarah had always trusted Mark, she had kept detailed notes in her journal throughout their marriage. These weren't just typical reflections. They were her attempts to understand her husband's increasingly strange behavior. As detectives pored over the entries, they found references to subtle red flags she had noticed in Mark's behavior long before that fateful night. Her journal was filled with entries that depicted a very different Mark than the one she thought she knew: the perfect husband, the devoted partner. These entries painted a darker picture of a man who had been wearing a mask, hiding his true identity from the woman who trusted him most. As the investigators began to piece together these journal entries, they realized that Sarah had been unknowingly documenting the exact moment Mark's manipulation had escalated. The journal had become a crucial piece of evidence, showing how Sarah's instincts had been trying to warn her all along. Yet, despite her growing concerns, she never truly grasped the extent of Mark's dark side until it was too late. The slow reveal of this information not only added weight to Sarah's story, but also exposed just how deep Mark's deception ran. When it seemed like everything had been uncovered, the case took another twist. A series of text messages were discovered between Mark and a third-party messages that outlined his desire to break Sarah's trust, to control her completely. These texts were chilling in their clarity. They revealed that Mark's request in the bedroom had been part of a larger plan, a means of asserting dominance and testing Sarah's loyalty, in ways that went far beyond any normal marital difficulty. In the end, Mark's carefully crafted facade shattered, and he was arrested and charged with multiple offenses, including assault, manipulation, and attempted coercion. The trial that followed was as dramatic as it was disturbing. Sarah's testimony brought forth the emotional and physical toll that the ordeal had taken on her, laying bare the deep scars that would remain long after the case was over. It became a national story, with media outlets covering every detail, raising difficult questions about how a crime of such magnitude could happen behind closed doors in a seemingly perfect marriage. The courtroom was filled with disbelief as Sarah described the anguish of discovering that the man she had loved and trusted for years was capable of such cruelty. For Sarah, the trial was a painful journey, but it also marked the beginning of her healing process. She slowly started to reclaim her life, one step at a time, though the emotional scars of what had happened would never truly fade. The case left a lasting impact on everyone involved. It sparked conversations about trust, manipulation, and the unsettling ways in which people can be deceived by the person they love most. It was a stark reminder that sometimes the greatest dangers lie within the very people we think we know the best. For Sarah, the road to recovery would be long, but as the months passed, she began to rebuild her life, her trust in herself, and her belief that one day she could find happiness again. But for many who followed the case, the lingering question remained: how did Mark's dark side go unnoticed for so long? And how many others had fallen victim to his manipulations before Sarah? It was a case that haunted everyone, one that raised unsettling questions about human nature and the secrets we keep hidden behind closed doors. What do you think about Mark's actions? Could Sarah have known sooner? Or was she completely blindsided by his manipulation? It's a tough question, and we'd love to hear your thoughts. Was there something in her journal that could have been the warning sign? Or was Mark just too good at hiding his true nature? Leave your comments below. We're eager to hear your opinions on this unsettling case. If you found this story chilling, please give us a thumbs up. Share this video with your friends so they can follow along with this jaw-dropping case. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We have more gripping true crime stories coming your way, stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. And if you're hungry for more twisted true crime tales, check out our other videos. From love and betrayal to shocking secrets and untold crimes, we dive deep into the mysteries that lie beneath the surface. Click here to watch more stories where the darkest parts of human nature come to light.